Hello, everybody. Good morning, dear AquaCosmplus partners and friends and colleagues. This is our first webinar that we will start soon. But before starting, we thought that we could have a poll on whether everybody can hear us. Katerina, can you put the poll on? Okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, it seems to be that, yeah, everybody can hear us. So I'll make a little bit introduction before inviting Miguel. And now I think it seems to be all fine. Yeah, okay. Everybody can hear us. Yeah. Okay, so this webinar activity of AquaCosmplus is a part of work package 3, which is about networking and training for knowledge transfer, and especially the task 2. In here, we wanted to provide several different platforms for training on mesocosm-based research to the researchers, students, facility users, and our transnational access users. So one of this platform is the webinar that we will organize quarterly webinars, and we will start off with the first one, which is on how to communicate your science, given by Dr. Miguel Leal. He's from Portuguese, and he's has his own. He's a scientist, but he has his startup company called Science Cruncher. He's into crunching complex scientific concepts into the easily digestible sort of problems to the different audience. And he's also from one of us. He's biologist, but on top of it, marine ecologist. And he has several publications and so on, you already know. And this first session, as you already know from the announcement of this webinar, this is 2-session webinar activity. The first one today is the more the theoretical part that we will focus on to how to communicate your science based on the audience strategy, narrative, and tools. And it will last for 40 to 45 minutes. And then we will spare 15 to 20 minutes for this discussion. Please write down your questions to the Q&A part, which is in the bottom of your screen. And then I will screen through those questions and I read them, and they will be directed to Miguel. And for that purpose, to keep this sort of the environment sort of safe, ready for Miguel, we muted everybody. And I think we can start now, Miguel. Yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, for the nice introduction, and thank you for this invitation to participate in this task of this interesting European project. We were supposed to be doing this all together, but I think this webinar will be a nice way to adapt to these new technologies and to this new world that we are living in. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and share the presentation with you. Okay, so as Miriam said, today I'll talk a little bit about how to communicate our science from a more theoretical perspective. And tomorrow the goal is to go on some practical examples that we could do as a workshop or as a homework ourselves. And basically, I founded this company, the Science Crunchers, a few years ago, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. So I want to cover these topics today: who I am, why am I here talking to you, and then the focus of the presentation will be split into 4 different sections. We will cover the first and one of the most important components, which is the audience. the strategy of your communication, how to build a narrative, and a brief introduction to a few tools that could and should be used. So moving to who I am, I'm a marine biologist. I started by doing a marine ecology master's in the University of Lisbon in Portugal. And then it was followed by a PhD at the University of Aveiro in collaboration with the University of Georgia in the Skidaway Institute of Oceanography, where I was supervised by Jens. Everyone knows Jens within the scope of this project for sure. And my PhD was focused on trophic interactions and marine invertebrates, mostly corals. And this was followed by a postdoc or a research contract in Switzerland at EVAC, nearby Lake Lucerne. It's a really nice place where there are also some mesocosms for experiments in ecology and evolution. I used to talk to Jens that the concept of mesocosms is quite different between different institutions and different scientific areas. Because when I compare the mesocosms in the Lake Lab and the ones we had at EVAG, they are not really the same thing. So I would say that I've had a very typical academic career, and one of the things that I really enjoyed a lot was scientific writing. So what for a lot of people is a painful process, for me it was something that I really enjoyed, to write scientific papers. And of course, I learned a lot from my advisors, and it made me be more proficient in the writing and enjoying this last part of communicating our science. And this was also the driver to when I returned to Portugal to be with my wife and my first kid at that time, because I had the postdoc secured, but I wanted to do something else, and I thought, well, what are my main skills that I acquired in my academic career that could be used as business? And so I thought that scientific writing could be helpful for some companies, and so I started this company that is called now the Science Crunchers, and it's turning 3 years this summer. And we started basically by helping others writing scientific papers, but now we do much more than that. So why am I here? But basically, as Miriam said, within the scope of this project, there was a task associated with different tools in the communication. And as I said before, I have a very good work and friendship relationship with Jens since a few years before my PhD, actually. And so this was the first driver to this to explore this webinar. I would say that given the expertise I've been acquiring in the last few years in communicating science, either to my peers as peer review publications and in scientific conferences, I've learned a lot in the past few years in the services that we are providing both to universities and to the private sector, to research-based companies, in how to convert data and technical information into contents for different types of audiences, and also in multiple formats, as you see here on the right side of the slide. You know, this is just a few examples of some illustrations about yeast cells, or activity books where we explain to little kids that there is life in the gut and what is the microbiome, and also some examples of graphical abstracts that we have been creating for scientific publications in different topics. So moving to what really matters here, communicating your science. So as I said, I'm going to focus on the audience, the strategy, the narrative, and the tools. And starting with the audience, in my opinion, when you prepare a communication, it's the first thing think about, because there's an audience that is a really expert in your fields, but there's the opposite end where you have the public and kids, and they are not really experts. And this is the first driver in terms of preparing your communication. And it doesn't matter if it's, you know, an oral communication, a written communication, a visual communication. For any type of format, you have to focus on your audience. For instance, if you're communicating to the public and you want to talk about the gut microbiome or bacteria, you should use simple forms and simple ways to show that there are, for instance, 2 important species in our gut. And these species have different forms and different functions. But if you want to talk about strain diversity or at the subspecies level, you need to find easy ways to communicate those differences. And here we can see different shades of green that are very easy ways for people to see that there are differences, but not as large as between, let's say, the purple and the green cells. Whereas in the opposite end, you're communicating to experts. And this is a figure we have prepared to a scientific paper on the fatty acid dynamics and the evolution in terms of the animals, marine animals or aquatic animals mostly. Well, not only, but you have also the finch here. But what I want to say here is that this is quite a complex figure. And even when you're reading a scientific publication, you'll probably need 5 to 10 minutes and carefully read the figure caption to understand what this means. It's quite complex language for those who are not familiar with fatty acid dynamics. For those who have been studying biochemistry and lipid metabolism, this is quite easy, but it's just an extreme example compared to communicating to kids. But there's all types of different audiences in between. And for instance, we work a lot with the industry, like, for instance, with the aquaculture sector, where you have people that have learned and have masters and PhDs, and so they know the technicalities, but they often don't care too much about you know, hardcore scientific details. They want to communicate what they do to their audience, let's say farmers, and you need to find ways that are a little bit more complex, but not so complex that people can understand and rapidly assimilate the information. And here we show, for instance, the life cycle of sea bream. We can easily see the different steps of the life cycle. We can see the different key points in terms of the development of the fish to reach to the market. And we can also see that nutrition and technology, rearing conditions, and genetics affect differently the different steps of the life cycle. So in summary, what I really want to say is you should know your audience. And this is essential to effectively communicate your science. And if you know your audience, you will increase the effectiveness of the message you are communicating, the willingness or receptiveness of the receiver of that message to really be paying attention to what you're saying and establish a better connection. And in order to maximize these key features, it's important to address questions such as, why am I here? Why am I speaking in this webinar? Why are you there? Why are you listening to me? And what are you expecting from me? What's in it for you? You know, if I can try to understand and address these questions properly, it will make me prepare a better communication that is more engaging and more interesting to you and more effectively communicate my message. And although there was a briefing about the scope of this webinar, I had no idea, you know, if it's mostly master students or PhD students or professors and project coordinators, if your background is aquatic ecology, if it's data analysis, if it's bioinformatics. So of course, it's not easy to address all these questions and know the right answers, but if you think about them, it's already clear. And with this in mind, and also in order to better prepare the presentation tomorrow, I'll ask Katarina to send a poll question in terms of what's your academic level, so that I can better understand who's on the other side listening to this webinar. Okay, so it's interesting. To be honest, when I thought about this communication, I thought the most of the persons attending would be students. I would say masters and PhD students. Thank you, Katarina. It doesn't mean that what I'm communicating is not relevant for postdocs or PIs and professors. I think it's always nice to see a different perspective or a different way of thinking when communicating your science. But this will also help me better communicating my message. Although the slides are prepared, you can adapt our speech, of course. So one thing to bear in mind in terms of the audience is emotions. And this is the Russell's model of affect, which describes emotional responses to environments. This is critical when you have a communication in person, because there's an emotional feedback, and you should and you need to understand your audience. But it also affects all other type of communications, being them written or videos, because if you can try to predict the emotional feedback, it helps you prepare your communication. And we have these two axes here, the one being between an unpleasant communication or a pleasure, a communication that triggers the emotion of pleasure, or a sleepy or arousing. And on one hand, you should be in the middle of everything, so that you don't have something that is distressing or very exciting or super boring or even too relaxing that you become sleepy. But if you have to prepare a communication that is very short or very long, maybe you should jump in between these different axes to make sure that it's something that is dynamic and not very static in terms of communication. And emotions are very important in communicating, because the behavior consequences of emotion is engagement. And engagement is what you really want, that your receiver of your message is engaged into what you're saying. We talk about engagement a lot nowadays in social media, with likes and shares and posts that are viral, and this means engagement. And it's probably because the message being communicating is triggering some kind of emotion. And so it's key for any communication that you prepare to think about your audience. If you don't think about your audience, it's like preparing or writing a love letter and starting with "to whom it may concern." And I don't know if you've ever wrote love letters, and if you did, I seriously doubt that you've started in this way, because you want to make sure that the receiver of your love letter is engaged into your communication. So you need to know who you are addressing. And with this, we jump to the next section, strategy. So strategy basically means addressing these 6 key questions. The first question is what? What are you going to communicate? What is the scope of your work? And how are you going to communicate it? Is it through a webinar? Is it through social media? Is it through a video on YouTube or vlogging? How are you going to communicate your message? The third reason, and also very, very important, is why. Why are you preparing your communication? Why why should you communicate your results? Is it because you have to? You are a PhD student and you need to publish and communicate to your peers? Or is it because it's important to communicate your science and you feel that the general public should know about what you're doing because it's relevant to them? So understanding your why will drive your motivation to prepare a really effective communication. The third question, the who, we talked about in the first section, the audience, but it's one of the key questions, again, for effectively communicating. The where question could be principally applied for, let's say, an oral communication or a seminar where you should understand where is the room, how is the room displaying, and understand how you're going to position, physically in the room to communicate better. But it can also apply to digital communications, not only in terms of the tools that I described on the how, but where is this going to be communicated? For instance, are you writing a blog post or a news piece that is going to be published in Europe or in Africa or in Latin America? Because different audiences and different locations will have different interests, and this will make sure that thinking about this topic will make sure that you prepare a communication that is effectively received by your audience. And the when, it's mostly important to make sure that you can prepare things timely and without doing everything in the last minute. It's also important to think about it, but hopefully everyone will be aware of the timing issues. The second and last thing I want to talk about, strategy, is what us as scientists can learn from sales. And sales theory and people who are the way that we perceive what sales means, it's usually not associated with our work as marine ecologists or as scientists. But if you think about it, 40% of our time is usually spent either persuading, convincing, or selling ideas. If you're writing a master thesis or a PhD thesis, you're selling your results. You are convincing your committee that you did a good job. If you're writing a scientific publication, you are also selling your ideas to your peers and convincing them that your results are worth publishing in a high impact journal, for instance. If you're a PI and you're writing a grant proposal, you need to persuade the reviewers that your ideas are worth buying and paying for. So if you think about the time that you spend per day or per week or per month as a scientist, there's a huge portion of this time that is selling what you're doing, not directly selling, products or services, but mostly your data and ideas. Moving to another key part of this presentation, we'll talk about how to build a good narrative, a narrative that supports an effective communication of your science. And a narrative is quite fixed in terms of science outputs. In general, we have a paper, a publication is our standard way of communicating our science to our peers, and the structure is quite fixed. You have an abstract followed by an introduction, methods, results, and discussion. You're all familiar with this structure. We're all trained to make sure that you know how to follow this structure, and this is what we have been learning throughout our careers as scientists. But in order to build a good narrative, you should start thinking about the topic that you're working, of course, and what is the problem that you are addressing? What is the solution that you're bringing to that problem? And this solution will bring benefits to who? And what are the benefits? And finally, the so what question. This was something that I learned a lot during my PhD in the United States. Everyone should know the answer to this question. So what does it matter what you're doing as a scientist? You should know how to explain this to anyone. You know, it's your work. You're the expert. But the truth is that this is quite difficult sometimes. We are so into that topic that put it into simple words is often very, very difficult. But my suggestion here is, you know, we have to write publications as scientists, and we should think about our work using these 4 different questions. And in order to know how to address the so what question, which is very difficult most of the times, what I think is that basically you first need to inform. And to make sure that you really inform your audience, you need to inspire them. And if they are inspired, it will, you know, facilitate a higher engagement. If they're really engaged into the message that you're telling them, the story that you're telling them, this will lead to a better information process. Of course, this is, you know, theoretical and very easy to say and very often difficult to accomplish successfully. So some things that we should think about when preparing this narrative is that we should simplify as much as possible our message, of course, depending on our target audience. If possible, we should illustrate it and personalize it. And in terms of simplification, it's not just taking out of all of the scientific jargon. You know, even the best scientific papers, they are simple, they are easy to read, you can understand the message, and it can be, you know, rocket science, but it's written in a simple way. In terms of illustration, it doesn't mean necessarily drawings and infographics. Of course, they are useful and helpful, but you can always illustrate what you're saying with examples. You can think about who's your audience, what they are interested into, and think about how you can make examples that are that can better convey your message. And in terms of personalized, this is very important because if I'm talking, for instance, for a group of PhD students, I should share my experiences as a PhD student and how fun it was to you know, have different experiences in different countries and doing field work in different places and networking events, but also sharing some painful process of leading with multiple revisions. And so I'm personalizing my story and trying to make sure that my audience is engaged in what I'm saying, because the simplification, the illustration, and the personalized part, they all trigger emotions. And as I said before, emotions are key in terms of effectively communicating your science. One of the really important tools in terms of narrative is storytelling. I don't know if you all have heard about storytelling or not. To be honest, I've only started learning about storytelling a few years ago when I founded this company. As scientist and writing publications, I was never really aware of storytelling as a tool. And there's this Native American proverb that says, "Tell me the facts and I will learn. Tell me the truth and I will believe. Tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever." So stories are a way, a tool to communicate your message. And as you know, from telling stories to your kids or to other kids, you probably remember stories that you listened as a kid, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And stories are a really, really strong and powerful way to communicate your science. There was a survey a few years ago by Prezi, this software that makes really dynamic presentations. And they asked, what is engaging? And 55% of the people said that what is engaging is a great story. followed by a stimulating dialogue, and only in the end by visual stimulation. Perhaps this is because nowadays we have so much visual stimulation everywhere in our computers, in our phones, when we go outside, and perhaps visual stimulation is no longer something that is a key ingredient for communication, but a great story has been, and I'm sure it will continue to be, the foundation of an engaging narrative. And you see this in books, you see this in TV shows, you see this in Hollywood movies. So the thing is, how can we as scientists learn from storytelling and apply it to our science? And remember that you have data, you're as a scientist, we generate data, and we want to communicate a message. So this message is supported by data. But we need something that drives and conveys this message, and this will be the story. We need a good story that drives the message and that is supported by data, even when writing scientific publications. But what I'm telling you is not rocket science. This has been described many years ago by Aristotle, and he described the 3 elements of persuasion: ethos, credibility, the second is pathos, which means emotions, and the third one means logical argument, logos. And what he said is, if in that period of time it was mostly targeting public speaking, but if you have these 3 key features in your speech and in your communication, it will be more likely a persuasive speech. And this also applies to stories, storytelling, and any kind of communication we do. Scientists, in theory, have all the credibility. We also have usually very facilitated ways to build a logical argument. I think as scientists, the more difficult component is emotions, and how can we trigger emotions in our communications. When we think about classic stories, there's always a setup, there's always a conflict, and a resolution. Any story that you think about will have what is called the 3-act structure. And the key, in my opinion, is how you convert your science, your abstract introduction methods, results, and discussion into this 3-act story. And you have the state of the art, we have the problem, the scientific gap that is being addressed, and finally your findings, the solution. So there's actually a direct link between this 3-act story. Of course, the main difference is that perhaps in classic stories, there's a huge focus on the setup and the conflict, whereas in science, most of our efforts are targeting our results, our findings. Of course, this doesn't need to change. We just need to make sure we focus on this 3-act structure. And when you prepare a narrative, and this can be, a visual presentation, can be a script for a video, can be a text, well, it can be a slideshow, for instance. You can categorize your narrative into these 2 axes, either something with no detail or very detailed, or something very pictorial or very wordy. And this will allow us to sort of label what you're presenting. For instance, if you see a slide deck that has no detail but is very wordy, it usually conveys the message that you have no idea about what you're doing. If it's very detailed and wordy, maybe it's very confusing and difficult to follow. In the bottom approaches, you see no detail and pictorial. Well, maybe it's not rigorous enough, or there's no narrative possible. But of course, what I'm showing you is a very generalization of how to build a narrative in terms of words and visuals and details. It doesn't mean that the center is the perfect place. In fact, there's an exception, and I'm sure there are many other exceptions. I've recently heard about something that is called Pecha Kucha. I don't know if you all heard about this format of presentations or not, but basically this is a format where the presenter has 20 images to present. Each slide is one image, and you have 20 seconds in each slide. And you cannot control the slides. So this is a very, very pictorial way of telling your story, but if it's well prepared, it's very, very powerful. So what I'm saying is you don't have to be at the center of this axis, but you should think about these different axes. So the next step is to talk a little bit and very briefly about tools to communicate your science. And this is something that we will explore a little bit tomorrow, but I'll give you some brief introductions now. Some of the important tools, not all, of course, is to think about the message, the sequence of ideas, the words that you're using, as a speech or writing, and the slides, if we're talking about using a presentation like this to communicate. Starting with the message. This is basically trying to address the so what question. And when you think about the different audiences and the so what, you can try to sort of label the different groups. Of course, and again, I apologize for this, I'm generalizing a bit too much. Not all policymakers just care about voters. Sometimes they care about other things. And this is just a way to making this a bit more general. But usually policymakers will ask, if their voters care about what you're doing, so this in terms of being interested in the message that you're going to communicate, you should think about the voters if you're communicating to policymakers. In terms of managers, they will often ask if it will solve their problems, what is the financial cost, the cost benefits. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, think about their agenda. Scientists, well, we think, is it new? Is this worth publishing? If I'm reading a publication, I usually think, does it relate to my work? So this is important to think about. In terms of media, will it sell? Will it generate likes and shares, subscriptions? And for the public, sometimes the more difficult, why does it matter to me? And because tomorrow we will focus on the different audiences and different tools, I know that you all have different interests in this webinar. You all have different ideas that you want to take out from here and apply to your communications. But I would like to know, if you think about who do you want to communicate to in your next weeks or months, or in your next communication you're preparing, who is your target audience? And so I would thank you, Katrina, to send this poll so that I can understand what's your interest here and who are you trying to communicate to. Okay, so we have a very, very clear result here that most people want to communicate to scientists, probably because everyone needs to write publications. PhD students, masters, postdocs need to communicate to scientists, either as as peer-reviewed papers, as seminars and webinars. There's also great interest into communicating to the general public, and let's say the other ones a little bit. And this is quite helpful for me because some of the practical components that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, they are not a scientific writing webinar, but I think it will give you some tools and some suggestions on how to write more efficiently, not only to scientists, but to other audiences and to the public as well, I hope. Thank you very much, Katrina. moving to the next tool, sequence, basically we have the setup, the conflict, and the resolution. As I said before, the introduction, problem, and solution. And this basically means having a sequence of ideas that tries to maximize the use of words such as and, but, and therefore. You know, if you're working on zooplankton in the aquatic environment and you want to say that zooplankton live in the water column and they can migrate vertically and they eat algae and they are being affected by climate change. Wow, but there is a big problem here. Climate change is happening, but we know nothing about what some species are eating and how they will cope with their changes in the environment. And when we talk about the solution, usually we try to say words like therefore, because you want to say you found this, therefore this means something else. And so try to think about the sequence of ideas and how they vary between the 3-act story that you're building. In terms of the selection of words, this is something we will explore a lot tomorrow, but it's a very nice plot I found last year, I think, on the average sentence length of the inaugural speeches of former US presidents. So as you see, and this happens in these speeches, but also in many, many other kinds of communications, the sentence length is rapidly, it has been decreasing over time. A long time ago, we used to have very long and complex sentences, and the trend nowadays is to have really short and powerful sentences. And this will help you also better communicating to your peers, to the public, to anyone. The trend nowadays is that our span and willingness to be listening to others and reading what the others are writing involves having shorter and powerful sentences. And the last, this is focused on slides, of course, but we could think about other approaches. But please remember, if you're communicating to scientists using a slide deck, what really matters are your ideas. And the words that you express and you use in your speech, they are used to communicate your ideas, and slides are simply a support of your words. So if we think on the other way around, if you have very wordy slides and you're reading your slides, why do the listeners need to be listening to you if they could be just reading the slides? This is something very, very specific in terms of this kind of output, but tomorrow we will talk about some others. So finally, we have to think about the audience. We have to think about the strategy, addressing those questions of the what, how, who, why, when, and where. We have to build a narrative, ideally, in my opinion, trying to take the most out of storytelling and focusing on the setup, the problems, and the solutions. And if possible, try to use some tools that I shared today. So this is my final slide. Basically, our company, the Science Crunchers, and the AQUACOSMplus project. And I really appreciate the time that you've been spending in this webinar. I hope that it was important and that you learned something. And with this, I'm taking all the questions.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was very nice. I think you set the scene very nicely for us to see more practice tomorrow. I think that was the idea, is to have the theoretical part today and tomorrow have more the examples. There are 3 questions I can see, but before then, I would like to ask you, I mean, through this COVID world, we turn to more onto the online, communication, and I've been teaching online courses, and I found it really difficult because I don't see the audience, and seeing the audience is an important way of weighing whether you have emotional trigger on it, you know, because
Yeah.
I don't see it. That's just, I see the pixels in my slides, you know, on these synchronized or asynchronized lectures. So emotion is, I really agree with you. Triggering emotion is very important. And this is something that we are not so maybe talented about it, because the scientists are fact-oriented, not like the artists, maybe. But this is also too generalization. I don't want to offend anyone, but I mean, is there any like tips and stuff that you could tell us? This, especially
Definitely.
with the online ones.
This
Yeah,
is a
thank you.
really important question nowadays, and you know, we're all seated in our computers. The interaction changed a lot. This Monday I was participating in a webinar where we were talking to PhD students that are preparing their defenses online via webinars. And given that the large audience here that we have is PhD students, I think some of the things we communicated are quite helpful. And my component was to talk about the contents, and I'm not basically repeat the narrative question here. We talked about the slides and building the slides, which I covered a little bit, but it's not going to address your question. And the other component was really the interaction between you and your audience. In the case of the PhD students, usually they see the audience because it's their committees, and usually their cameras are on, and you can sort of read the body language a little bit, but it's completely different from the traditional defenses. From your side, in terms of communicator, what becomes really important are the slides, because you are sharing your screen, and whereas in the physical format, people can be distracted by your body language, by someone on the audience, by something else. Here, the focus is really the slides and your voice, and next your image, which is limited to the square, right? So it's important that the slides are really well prepared, but for the interaction and the emotions, it's important that your voice is not really loud or really boring, and try to have some dynamics in the way that you communicate to make sure that it's a dynamic presentation and not a boring one. Mm-hmm. Of course, the problem is always how to receive the emotion from the other side. And here you have to be limited to the square if they're sharing the camera. I think the polling that we use today is a nice system, and we can make this a little bit more dynamic and less one-to-one or just unidirectional conversation from my side to yours. So taking the most out of questions, I think it's also a good idea. And the way that you position yourself is also important, because if you show that you are in a correct position, and you're not like this, like what you're doing with the computers, and that you're not doing like this or doing like that, it's also helps in the communication and emotion to the other side. But the response feedback, that's, you know, creating dynamics with questions like we're doing today.
Okay, thank you. And I see the chats and the questions, and I receive a lot of thanks to you. They enjoyed it very much. Since all our audience are muted, we all communicate through, I'm reading their text, and I think they are very happy. And there is one suggestion that from Jones, he says that he gives small quizzes to trigger activities, emotions.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I will just read some questions. And the one that asked by Kyle Mayers from Norse, and it's similar to mine, but maybe you may need to add some little bit. Says that, thanks for interesting webinar, Miguel. Do you have a question on how to keep engagement high during digital talks and school visits, etc. School, I suppose, like the younger audience and
Yes,
so
no,
on.
I think in
Maybe
terms of the digital, we covered this a little bit with the questions, with the polling, with of course it's something that you need to be aware of what's the potential of that tool. And honestly speaking, it was something we only discussed yesterday for this webinar, and that we will try to maximize for tomorrow's, because it's more practical and it's something that it's also new to me. So I'm not an expert on webinars, so it's a learning process. In terms of school visits, I think it's always important to think about the story, but have different materials that the kids can relate to, and bring something like a physical book that supports you. Don't take a slideshow, because probably they will only care if there's cartoons moving on. But at least when I consider my kids and when I go to their school, so I'm talking about ages to 5, it's really about books and stories and toys. So of course this changes to older school visits for older audiences that are more aware of slideshows and more engaged into this type of communication. So this would be my suggestion.
Okay. There is one question that from Christian Schauwaber or something. Maybe I'm too bad in the pronunciation, but she knows you. Or he says, "Hi, Miguel, and nice to meet you again. Thanks for this great webinar." He's wondering that if you have scientific publications at hand where you think that science has been very well communicated, as an example. So I think this is a very nice, it would be nice to share it maybe tomorrow with everybody. Yeah, and tomorrow, maybe even work on the good example and the bad example. Yeah. I guess you plan this.
Tomorrow I have planned a little bit of this. It's not a scientific publication, and I think it's a good example, but I'll use my own examples as good and bad examples, because I don't want to share bad examples to others. But it's a good question, and for instance, sometimes I think about my own papers, and I'm a co-author of, for instance, a Nature, Ecology and Evolution paper, which should be a really good paper, but I have really problems reading the abstract that we wrote, and because it's just so complex. I don't think it's a good way, a good publication, because the data and the story is so complex, and we didn't do a good job in terms of writing it in a simple way.
I think this is perfect. This is what we need, really, definitely what we need in every level, not only PhD level, but every, higher level as well, because lately most of the papers' titles and the abstracts and keywords are too far complicated that it may even sound a foreign language to many of us. Yeah, that's really nice. There is one more question. Pam says that, thanks for the interesting presentation, Miguel. Do you have any rules regarding amount of the time spent per slide? I mean, how do you weigh it to not to bore?
I don't have any rules, to be honest, and I think it was a good example of. I don't think we should spend 5 minutes in one slide, but again, if your audience is a scientific audience, and if you are showing, for instance, that figure on the fatty acid dynamics, you need to spend time explaining that figure, because otherwise your audience will not follow. You should also avoid spending too much time talking about a very simple slide, unless you have a lot of things to say. But I don't know any rules about time to be spent per slide, to be honest. I'm sorry.
Okay. There is one question. Hang on. Semge. I don't know how to pronounce it. Poda. Surname is Poda. Hi, Miguel. What program do you suggest using to prepare the presentation besides PPT, PowerPoint?
That's a good question. Most often I use PowerPoint. It's a universal tool nowadays. This presentation was prepared using Keynote, which is the equivalent of PowerPoint in Macs. I'm getting more and more familiar, and I'm enjoying using this tool. But I think it's quite standard like PowerPoint. The other tool I know and that I've used is Prezi. The talk I gave you today was adapted from a previous talk I made with Prezi, which was quite a nice challenge. It takes a while to build a Prezi presentation, and I think it's really good to tell stories.
Yeah.
But I think there's one thing we should be aware of. And there was one day I was at a conference. It was not a webinar, so it was a few years ago. And someone made a presentation with Prezi with lots of zoom ins and zoom outs and dynamics, lots of movement. And in the end of the talk, someone in the audience said, this is really fancy, but I have vertigo. I don't know. He gave us statistics of the population that have vertigo. Apparently, it's a high portion of the population, and people with vertigo feel nausea when they are seeing a Prezi presentation. And so that made me think that, although for me it looks quite fancy and quite modern, for the audience it can result in serious problems and not a good emotional feedback for sure.
I completely understand you, that I also had the similar feelings. Maybe I have an inclination for vertigo as well. There's one nice question. I think it will be very handy tomorrow to include into the discussion by Catherine. She says that I found that when writing manuscript with multiple authors, the flow of reading sometimes seems to be very strange after multiple people revised it. It's because of different styles, different wording, and so on. Have to merge, have to come out this chaotic interaction into one nice, entertaining, triggering story. That's basically the question is.
Well, I would say the easy solution, but not the one you should follow, is to pay an editing and proofreading company that will go through the manuscript and make that changes for you. But in my opinion, in the way that we build our manuscripts, and the authorships, we have a leading author, we have co-authors, and then we have a senior author that is in the last position. The way I see this, the first and the last author should be the one that are mostly in charge of what is being done, and the ones in charge for the final result. So in my opinion, it should be the first and the last author, or the more senior author, to go through the manuscript, make the edits, and make sure that there's a similar style and uniform and consistent way of writing. Of course, that the other co-authors should be aware that this is something that is real. It's not a problem. Everyone writes differently, and don't take it as a problem to see someone editing their text. Usually, I think people are aware of this, so that's
I called it, my writing is Tinglish, Turkish English, so I always need someone to turn it to a better English. Thank you. Jens has a comment. Let me see. He says that I agree with you, Miguel, about the general structure, very good, but as sometimes the exception is the most successful in special cases. Are you aware of any example when communicating totally breaking these rules and still, or because of it, being very effective? Had it happened to you? Or?
Well, I would have to. I think I was never the exception in breaking the rules, to be honest. I gave the example of the Pecha Kucha format of presentations, which breaks the rules. It's just pictures and someone speaking. I saw a presentation that used music to convey the results, but this was people that were using, the focus of their topic was using music to address questions in biology. So it was not a format of a presentation, but it was an exception in terms of merging two completely different disciplines, biology and music, in in a topic related with evolution. So in the top of my mind, I don't think of other examples other than this. But I agree with you. And sometimes the exception can be outstanding because it's unexpected, so it creates some suspense, right?
Okay, yeah, that's the case. There is one question by Zeynep. Zeynep says that thanks a lot for the webinar, Miguel. Now with increasing YouTube Zoom seminar, we are also communicating with other scientists with different expertise. You know, not from your field, but you need to collaborate somehow with a mathematician or maybe a different field, person from different field. Could you give some tips for better communicating to them?
No, that's
knowing your story, I guess.
this is true for Zoom and YouTube, but also as before, if we had multidisciplinary meetings, we would have to interact with people from other areas. You know, I'm not really know how to address this question, because in my experience in my company, that's what we do, right? We talk between technicians, scientists, marketeers, designers, engineers, and what I find the success in the communication is that as scientists, we know where to go and pick up more information, and we know how to read the paper. We are not experts in everything, but I think the most difficult part is really to explain our own work to other areas, and you know, just make an exercise of explaining your work to your kids or to your grandparents and see how it goes. Practice with them, because I'm not saying that on the other side of the webinar you'll have a chemist, a designer, an architect that has the same knowledge of your grandmother, but it's an example of how to make sure that you can practice communicating what you're doing to someone who's completely a non-expert. And so this is the other extreme, and I'm sure you'll find a way to communicate something in the middle.
I think, I think it's also important to take your time to dwell on it, isn't it? Because there's a recent paper published in Limnology and Oceanography on how to sort of create an article that is short and concise. And in there, the article starts with a word by Pascal, the famous mathematician, French mathematician. He says that I'm writing a longer letter than usual because there is not enough time to write a short one. I think it's quite a nice one. So
exactly.
yeah, thinking through your 4 squares, that like the narrative and all the corners, you need to dwell on it. You need to create your story, and by thinking of it. Let me see whether there is any question that I did not address. Jens has a comment. He says that, could Miguel make a checklist with explanatory keywords after each checklist words? I'm not quite sure what he meant. Maybe at the end of each section, sort of making the checklist.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Can be handy maybe tomorrow.
Yes, I can prepare it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, if you don't wish to. I'm copying all these questions.
I just realized that I forgot to send the last pool of questions.
Okay, maybe we could do it with the 58 people.
Basically, it was about which communication platform do you intend to use to communicate your science? I don't know if we are. Yes, thank you, Katrina. I'm sorry that I forgot this.
Okay, maybe we can finish with this pool.
Yeah.
Miguel, I copied the questions in case there are some that I miss.
Okay.
Did not address. You may look at it. I'll share it with you. Yeah.
Sure, and I think there's a comment here by end, if I don't answer all the questions, I can just try to summarize them tomorrow, or if there's no time tomorrow, then I'll write write an answer.
Okay.
Okay, so basically social media, websites, dissemination articles. Perfect. Yeah, I think yes. Tomorrow I have some examples on communicating using social media to other scientists, which basically merges the two main results of the last two polls. So perfect. Thank you very much, Katrina.
Yeah, there's one example from Catherine. She says that I once saw someone reciting a poem as a poster flash talk that was super effective. So sort of like merging the science and the art and creating a new room might be effective communication for some people, for triggering emotions, I suppose. So
definitely.
yeah.
But then we also need to be super talented, and
Yeah.
I would be terrible at doing that.
Yeah, that needs to be like reading more and being aware of all the sort of new things. I think it's time up. Time is already past 1:08. I mean, in Turkish time, of course, it's 12 in Central European, but for you it's 11, isn't it, Miguel?
Yes,
you are 2 hours. For
For
our attendees from UK as well, the same. So I think we had a very nice first session, and we are inviting everybody to join to the tomorrow's session. It will be more practical, and it will have seeing the good and the bad examples, and we will deep dive into the problem. Yeah, is that right, Miguel?
Yes.
You want to add something?
I will prepare today some questions and poolings so that we can try to make it more dynamic.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining it, and it was fantastic. I think I'm so happy that we organized this. Bye bye. Bye bye. Now.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow, everybody.